Hola, comrades! Today's topic of interest, Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn. As plentiful as RPG franchises are, direct sequels are surprisingly rare in them. The average successful big-budget RPG explores its world so thoroughly and ties off so many narrative ends that making a sequel that expands on the original is difficult. Most franchises don't even try. Final Fantasy, for example, creates a different world for every numbered entry in the series, the only commonalities being pieces of series iconography, such as chocobos and moogles. When Final Fantasy has tried to create sequels to its games, such as in the case of Final Fantasy X-2 and the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy, it has generally embarrassed itself. Investing so heavily in the divisively received FF13 was misguided, as was the belief that Final Fantasy X, an utterly complete and cathartic game, needed a sequel. While X-2 is more disappointing and hollow than downright unsalvageable, and Revenant Wings, the sequel to Final Fantasy XII, is solid, none of the Final Fantasy sequels managed to escape the shadows of their parent games. The same is true regarding the sequels to Wind Waker, meaning Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks. While Zelda games take place on a single timeline, with new Zeldas and Links being created to battle the Spirit of Demise, which manifests itself in Ganon, only those two games directly proceed from the story of Wind Waker, and while both, especially the underrated Spirit Tracks, are excellent, neither captures the grandeur, nuance, and surprisingly heartfelt storytelling of Wind Waker. However, Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn managed to not only match, but surpass its predecessor, Path of Radiance. Both games, despite dedicating an inordinate and distracting amount of attention to world building, are some of the most intelligent and ambitious RPGs of the 2000s. But Radiant Dawn is a greater success both because it expands the ideas introduced by Path of Radiance, and because it is unafraid to subvert the ethos of that game. In 2005, Fire Emblem Path of Radiance was released to widespread acclaim. In Japan, it was another successful entry in a long-running franchise, but in the West, it was the first Fire Emblem game released for a console. While it was not immediately successful, and indeed, the franchise would not become huge in the West until Fire Emblem Awakening, it won over critics and did more than the two previous games released in the West, both made for the GBA, to impress upon the West what this series is capable of being. These first two games had the hallmarks of the series, meaning an overstuffed fantasy mythology, permanent death, and battlefield conversations, but Path of Radiance surpassed them with more vivid characterization and a story that strayed further than usual from the JRPG tradition of grafting a simplistic story onto an overcomplicated world, and by straying, it entered into more thematically interesting and emotionally fertile territory. This is a world divided into two major races, and how the conflict between them is handled exemplifies how the trappings of fantasy provide room to explore racial conflicts without everything being a direct statement on racism in our world. The same is true of Zootopia. A commonly voiced criticism of Zootopia, that the racism in the film and the racism in contemporary American society do not line up perfectly and thus the film doesn't work, is ridiculous. When I want to watch a film about racism in America, I will watch a film directly and indisputably talking about racism in America, not a fantasy movie allegorically discussing that racism. Fantasy works about racism and prejudice have value because they can explore these issues without being limited to the specifics of them as they exist in our world. Done poorly, this can be silly at best and ludicrous at worst, but done well, it can lend a work flexibility and power, such as in Zootopia and Path of Radiance. The two races are the Bjork, who are humans, and more interestingly, the Laguz, who are more animalistic and have the power to transform into animals. The Bjork have traditionally had more power and influence, looking down upon the Laguz, treating them abysmally, and even keeping them as slaves. However, not all Bjork nations are equally oppressive, and not all the Laguz races are equally oppressed. The Dragon Laguz, who formed the nation of Goldoa, are less subject to Bjork oppression than other Laguz tribes, both because of their incredible power and because of their ability to pass for Bjork. In a move reminiscent of Wakanda, they do not use their power to help other Laguz populations. Instead, they isolate themselves from the rest of the continent. Crimea, not related to our Crimea, is a more progressive Bjork nation and seeks to build alliances with the Laguz nations, while Begnion, formerly the undisputed superpower of the Tellius continent, has seen its power wane. It passed the Laguz Emancipation Act, ending slavery of Laguz, but systematic discrimination against Laguz continued, leading the Laguz populations to follow the example of the Dragon Laguz and form their own nations. However, even this Emancipation Act was too much for the citizens of Dain. Reactionary and racist tendencies led the nation to successfully secede from Begnion. This is what I was talking about when I said the world building feels less empty in Path of Radiance. Not only are the relations between the nations well established, but these relations are heavily derived from the game's central theme of prejudice. Also worthy of note, because the Laguz, despite their historical oppression and the difficulties they face trading with other nations, because of prejudice, have countries of their own, they are still treated better than the Branded, who are half Bjork and half Laguz and are not accepted anywhere. The protagonist of Radiant Dawn, Micaiah, is both a resident of Dain and a Branded, situating her at a fascinating cross-section of Tellius. While the execution on her character is not fantastic, and she disappointingly fades somewhat to the background as the game progresses, the outline of her character is fascinating, even before the revelation that she is the older sister of Begnion's Empress Sanaki, and therefore the rightful apostle of Begnion. The bold move to position her as the protagonist is indicative of how Radiant Dawn moves away from the straightforward morality of its predecessor to deliver an excoriating, meditative, transgressive experience. Despite Path of Radiance's rich, clever narrative execution, the narrative itself was a little disappointingly simple. It had a broad scope and effective enough characterization to justify that scope, but the objective of the story was to defeat the Mad King Ashnard, who was monstrous even by Dain standards, having murdered his way to the throne, and that main story objective never changed. This was not a problem because the narrative had ambition and a nuance, but it did present an opportunity for Radiant Dawn to surpass the original game. If it had tried to expand upon the dynamics of the first game without subverting them, it would have felt lesser and been lost in Path of Radiance's shadow. While Revenant Wings lacked ambition and Final Fantasy X-2 was convoluted, thin, misguided, and banal, as I said in my far too long video about it, which I will link to in the description, both the Wind Waker sequels were able to expand upon the ideas of the original game, but they did not subvert anything about it, so they never seemed essential. This is the same reason The Force Awakens, despite being an exhilarating fantasy adventure, didn't justify the existence of more Star Wars films, while The Last Jedi, which was willing to attack and analyze the traditional ethos of Star Wars, did. Radiant Dawn subverts the expectations set by Path of Radiance immediately by setting a resident of Dain, which Path of Radiance considered a practically evil country, as the protagonist. Immediately, her general moral goodness is made apparent. This isn't an apologist for tyranny or an enemy of Laguz. She's a desperate woman who wants to free her nation. Since the events of Path of Radiance, Dain's independence has been stolen, and the country has been occupied by Begnion. This is not without parallel. Both the Confederate South and Nazi Germany were occupied after their defeats. However, Begnion, ruled by a corrupt and rapacious Senate, has no desire to reform Dain or see it succeed. The occupation force is exploitative and unjust. It wants to make itself rich and punish the citizens of Dain. Micaiah is not a supporter of Ashnard. She simply wants to liberate the country from its oppressors. Path of Radiance ended with the villains being defeated and disaster being averted. This is presented as an overwhelmingly triumphant ending, but Radiant Dawn challenges this assumption. While Ashnard may have been a tyrant, are the people of Dain supposed to be thankful for this overthrow when he has been replaced by exploiters who want to rob and punish them? These complications abound in the narrative. One of the soaring highs of Path of Radiance was when Princess Alincia was crowned queen. Her nation had been invaded by Ashnard, and despite being a sheltered, shy girl at the start of the game, she matured into a confident woman and helped Ike defeat the tyrant. However, in Radiant Dawn, she faces an existential challenge to her reign. Despite how Dain has struggled because of Begnion, her nation, Crimea, was relatively lenient to the defeated Dain, choosing instead to promote unity. A rebel faction rises against her, disagreeing with her soft treatment of Dain. Though the rebels eventually are defeated, the storyline nevertheless questions Alincia's Path of Radiance happy ending. That game was about her growth into a leader. Radiant Dawn asks what it means to rule. Even as more information is given about the Laguz and the mythology of the world, there's always an eye towards subverting expectations. Thus, none of the new information feels excessive or unnecessary. It's never there simply to justify there being a sequel to Path of Radiance. It always feels purposeful. Even the absurdly high-stakes battle at the end of the game fits with the idea of breaking from the logic of the first entry. It not only attacks the idea of Yune being a dark god, it attacks the idea of chaos being inherently bad. In the final battle, the heroes are allied with Yune against the Goddess of Order, who wants a perfect world, meaning one she can control absolutely. Chaos and order are both essential, the work suggests, so prioritizing a world without chaos is a mistake. Both Radiant Dawn and Final Fantasy X-2 take place 3 years after the games preceding them. Both games attempt to grapple with the world-changing events that occurred in the previous games, and what the new world should look like. However, while X-2 flounders its potential by focusing on gratuitous fan service and the power of song, Radiant Dawn intelligently exceeds its predecessor by building off the question of that predecessor to tell new and provocative stories while resolutely questioning whether that foundation is as solid as it claims. I didn't appreciate this game enough when it was released. When I first got it for Christmas as a child, I was expecting it to be simpler. I had liked and played Zelda games, so I expected this to be a turn-based version of that. What I got was a mammoth, impressively intricate RPG that I did not know how to handle. Even when I returned to this game as a teenager and finally understood it to be a masterpiece, I still did not understand how special it was. I was at that stage of my life just before I started writing books. That stage of my life that was both exhilaratingly wondrous and abjectly horrifying. That stage of my life when I was absorbing classic works constantly. I had a whole world of great art to explore, and I explored it as quickly as I could. Now, as I record this, I'm 19. I'm still young, but I'm not a kid anymore. The period of my life when there was a new work to find everywhere I looked is over. I'm still indulging myself in the great art of the past, of course, but I have to look a little harder for it. A lot of the films I watch nowadays are from other countries. I don't say that to be snobbish or elitist. I say that because part of me misses being able to find great art so easily. But a larger part of me is glad I absorbed all that knowledge early on. There are 2 reasons. Number 1, I have more time to relax and write and make these essays now. Number 2, my vantage point for viewing games like Radiant Dawn has matured and expanded. I'm more able to see how special and distinct it is. Anyway, if you liked what you saw today, consider donating to my Patreon so I can produce even more Radiant content. Also, don't forget to like and comment and subscribe, all that sequential stuff. Adios, comrades!